My brother announced at my rehearsal dinner I'd stolen from our dying father. The will reading made him faint. No. Jeremy stood up during the toasts at my rehearsal dinner, his face red from the 3 whiskeys he'd already finished, and told everyone in the private dining room that I had been stealing from our dying father's bank accounts for the past 6 months. He said it loud enough that the waiters stopped serving dessert, and my fiancé's parents went completely silent at their table near the window. I was holding David's hand when Jeremy started talking, and I felt David's fingers tighten around mine as my brother pulled out printed bank statements and waved them in the air like evidence at a trial. The room had 40 people in it, all of them staring at me while Jeremy explained in precise detail how I had transferred over $80,000 from Dad's accounts into my own checking account, how I had used Dad's declining mental state to manipulate him into giving me access to everything, how I was bleeding him dry while he lay in a hospice bed barely conscious. My future mother-in-law, Patricia, put her hand over her mouth and looked at David with this expression of horror mixed with pity. And I knew in that moment that no matter what I said next, some of these people would always wonder if Jeremy was telling the truth. David stood up beside me and told Jeremy to sit down, that this was neither the time nor the place for whatever he thought he was doing. Jeremy laughed, actually laughed, and said that I had everyone fooled. That sweet little Cassidy who spent every evening at Dad's bedside was actually robbing him blind while pretending to care. I tried to speak, but my throat closed up completely, like someone had wrapped their hands around my neck and squeezed until no air could get through. My best friend Lauren jumped up from her table and shouted that Jeremy was drunk and needed to leave, but Jeremy just kept going, explaining how he had discovered the transfers when he finally got around to checking on Dad's finances last week, how he had copies of everything, how he had already contacted an attorney about filing charges against me. My Aunt Rebecca, Dad's younger sister, stood up and asked Jeremy why he was bringing this up now, instead of going to the police if he really believed I had stolen from Dad. Jeremy turned to her and said he wanted to give me a chance to confess in front of everyone, to admit what I had done before he took legal action, that he thought maybe public shame would force me to return the money and do the right thing. The entire room felt like it was spinning, and I realized I was going to either throw up or pass out if I didn't get out of there immediately. David grabbed my elbow and guided me toward the door while Lauren blocked Jeremy from following us, and I heard Jeremy shouting behind me that I couldn't run from this, that the truth always came out eventually. We made it to the hallway outside the dining room before my legs gave out and I sank down onto the carpet with my back against the wall, gasping for air while David knelt beside me and kept saying my name over and over. The rehearsal dinner ended early with most of the guests leaving quietly while whispering to each other about what they had just witnessed, and David's parents asked if we should postpone the wedding that was scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. David told them absolutely not, that Jeremy was clearly having some kind of breakdown and none of this was real, but I could see the doubt in Patricia's eyes when she looked at me. Lauren stayed behind after everyone else left and sat with me in that hallway for 2 hours while I explained the entire situation to her and David, told them about how I had moved back home 6 months ago when Dad's cancer became terminal, how I had quit my job in Austin to care for him full-time, how Jeremy had barely visited Dad at all during the entire illness, except for one weekend back in August when he needed to borrow $5,000. David listened without interrupting, and when I finished he said he believed me completely, that he knew me and knew I would never steal from anyone, especially not my own dying father. But even as he said it, I could see him processing the fact that Jeremy had physical evidence, bank statements that supposedly showed transfers from Dad's accounts to mine, and I knew that seed of doubt was planted now whether David wanted it there or not. That night, I barely slept in the hotel room David and I had booked for the wedding weekend, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out how Jeremy had faked those bank statements, or if maybe Dad had actually transferred money to me and I had somehow missed it. At 4 in the morning, I finally gave up on sleep and called the hospice facility where Dad was staying to check on him. The night nurse, Angela, answered and told me Dad had been sleeping peacefully all evening, that he hadn't woken up since yesterday afternoon. I asked if Jeremy had been there recently, and Angela checked the visitor log, then told me Jeremy had visited 3 times in the past week, always late at night when Dad was already asleep, which struck me as strange since Jeremy lived 2 hours away and had barely made the effort to visit at all in the previous 5 months. Something about that information made my stomach clench with a different kind of anxiety, not just fear about the accusations, but a growing suspicion that Jeremy was planning something more than just a public confrontation. I thanked Angela and hung up, then spent the next hour sitting in the dark hotel room trying to piece together what Jeremy might have done and why he would do it now, the night before my wedding, when he knew the accusation would cause maximum damage and humiliation. The wedding happened despite everything. A small ceremony in a garden venue with 80 guests who had all heard about Jeremy's accusations by that point, thanks to social media and family phone calls that had apparently gone on all night. My mother, who had divorced Dad 15 years ago and moved to Oregon, flew in that morning and pulled me aside before the ceremony to ask if there was any truth to what Jeremy was saying. I looked at her in disbelief and told her no, absolutely not, that I had been caring for Dad while Jeremy disappeared for months at a time. Mom nodded but said she had to ask, that Jeremy seemed very certain and had evidence, and I realized that even my own mother was questioning whether I might be capable of stealing from my dying father. The ceremony itself was beautiful despite the dark cloud hanging over it, with white flowers everywhere and string lights wrapped around the oak trees, but I could barely focus on the vows because I kept scanning the guests looking for Jeremy. He didn't show up, which was somehow worse than if he had come and caused another scene, because his absence felt like a statement, like he was so disgusted with me that he couldn't even witness my wedding. David held my hands during the vows and looked directly into my eyes while promising to stand by me through everything, and I knew he meant it, but I also knew that doubt was still there beneath his certainty, a small question mark that would remain until I could prove Jeremy was lying. The reception was subdued compared to what we had planned, with people dancing and eating but always with this weird tension in the air, like everyone was waiting for something else to happen. David's brother, Christopher, got drunk and made a toast about loyalty and trust that was clearly directed at the situation with Jeremy, saying that real families stood by each other in hard times and didn't abandon each other when things got difficult. Several people clapped, but others looked uncomfortable, and I spent most of the reception hiding in the bridal suite trying not to cry, while Lauren brought me champagne and kept assuring me that everyone who mattered knew the truth. Around 9 that evening, my phone buzzed with a call from Angela at the hospice. Dad had woken up briefly and was asking for me, which was unusual since he had been mostly unconscious for the past week. I told David I needed to leave immediately, and he said he would come with me, so we changed out of our wedding clothes and drove the 30 minutes to the hospice facility, still wearing our reception outfits. David in slacks and a dress shirt, me in the simple blue dress I had changed into for dancing. Dad looked smaller than I remembered, which seemed impossible since I had seen him just yesterday morning before the rehearsal dinner, but somehow he had diminished even more in those 24 hours. His skin was gray and papery, his breathing shallow and rattling, but his eyes were clear when they focused on me as I walked into the room. He tried to smile and I grabbed his hand, feeling how cold and fragile it was, like bones wrapped in tissue paper. Dad whispered my name and told me congratulations on getting married, that he wished he could have been there to walk me down the aisle. I told him it was okay, that we had FaceTimed him earlier so he could watch the ceremony, and he squeezed my hand with what little strength he had left. Then his eyes shifted to look at something past me, and I turned to see Jeremy standing in the doorway, his face pale and his expression unreadable. Dad's grip on my hand tightened slightly and he said Jeremy's name, then asked him to come closer. Jeremy walked over slowly and stood on the opposite side of the bed, not looking at me at all, just staring down at Dad with his jaw clenched tight. Dad looked between us and said he knew what Jeremy had done, that he knew about the accusations at the rehearsal dinner, that Angela had told him when she checked on him this morning. Jeremy started to speak, but Dad held up one trembling hand to stop him, then said in a voice that was barely more than a whisper that he knew the truth about everything, that he had known for weeks what was really happening with his bank accounts. My heart started pounding because I had no idea what Dad was about to say, whether he believed Jeremy's lies or if he knew something I didn't. Dad explained that 3 weeks ago, when he was having one of his more lucid days, he had called his bank to check his account balances because something felt wrong about the numbers Jeremy had been telling him. The bank manager had walked him through recent transactions and Dad had discovered that someone had indeed been transferring money out of his accounts, large sums over the past 4 months, but those transfers weren't going to my account. They were going to Jeremy's. Dad said he had the bank send him detailed statements showing every transaction, and he had kept them hidden in his bedside table along with a letter he had written explaining everything. Jeremy's face went white and he started backing toward the door, but Dad told him to stay, that he needed to hear this. Dad explained that Jeremy had forged transfer documents to make it look like the money had gone to me, that he had probably used software to alter the bank statements he showed everyone at the rehearsal dinner, but the real statements told a completely different story. I felt like someone had just dumped ice water over my head, this sudden shock of understanding that made everything click into place. Jeremy had been stealing from Dad for months, probably since right after Dad's diagnosis when he realized Dad would eventually die and leave an inheritance. But at some point, Jeremy must have worried that someone would discover the missing money, so he created fake evidence to frame me for the theft, making sure that if anyone started asking questions, I would be the one who took the blame. Dad continued talking, his voice getting weaker with each sentence, explaining that he had contacted his attorney, Bernard, and had everything documented, that Bernard had instructions to present all the evidence if anything happened to Dad before he could clear my name publicly. Jeremy was shaking now, actually trembling as he stood there listening to Dad dismantle his entire scheme. I wanted to scream at Jeremy, wanted to launch myself across the bed and hurt him the way he had hurt me, but David's hand on my shoulder kept me still. Dad looked at Jeremy with an expression that wasn't anger or disappointment but something closer to profound sadness, and told him he had hoped Jeremy would eventually confess and return the money, that he had been waiting for weeks for Jeremy to do the right thing, but instead Jeremy had tried to destroy his sister's reputation to save himself. Jeremy finally spoke, his voice cracking as he said he needed the money, that he was drowning in debt from bad investments and his business was failing and he didn't know what else to do. Dad closed his eyes for a long moment, then opened them and said that financial problems didn't justify stealing, and certainly didn't justify framing an innocent person, especially not family. Jeremy started crying, these ugly gasping sobs, and said he was sorry, that he never meant for it to go this far, that he panicked when he realized people might start asking questions about Dad's accounts. I stood there watching my brother fall apart and felt absolutely nothing, no pity or sadness or even satisfaction, just this cold, empty space where my love for him used to be. Dad told Jeremy he needed to leave and not come back, that he didn't want to see him again before he died, and those words seemed to break something in Jeremy. He stumbled out of the room without looking at either of us, and I heard him throwing up in the hallway bathroom a minute later. David went after him to make sure he was okay, and I sat alone with Dad in that quiet room filled with beeping machines and the smell of antiseptic and death. Dad apologized to me for not speaking up sooner, for letting Jeremy's accusations ruin my rehearsal dinner and cast a shadow over my wedding day. I told him he had nothing to apologize for, that he was dying and dealing with cancer, and I didn't expect him to be managing family drama on top of everything else. But Dad shook his head and said he should have said something as soon as he discovered what Jeremy was doing, that he had hoped waiting would give Jeremy a chance to come clean on his own, and that hope had been stupid and naive. He reached over to his bedside table and pulled open the drawer with shaking hands, then withdrew a manila envelope that was stuffed with papers. He handed it to me and said everything was in there, all the real bank statements, the letter he had written explaining the situation, and contact information for Bernard, who had copies of everything in his office. Dad told me to make sure everyone who had been at the rehearsal dinner saw these documents, that he couldn't have people thinking I was a thief when he knew the truth. I promised him I would, and tucked the envelope into my bag, then spent the next hour just sitting with him and holding his hand while he drifted in and out of consciousness. David came back eventually and told me Jeremy had left the building without saying anything to anyone, that he had looked completely destroyed as he walked out to his car. I didn't care where Jeremy went or how he felt because all I could think about was how he had been willing to ruin my entire life to cover up his own crimes, how he had stood in front of 40 people, including my future in-laws, and accused me of something horrible, knowing it was a lie, knowing it would damage my reputation permanently. David sat down in the chair next to mine and put his arm around my shoulders, and we stayed there with Dad until the sun started coming up through the window. Angela came in around 6 to check Dad's vitals and told us we should go home and get some rest, that Dad would probably sleep most of the day. I didn't want to leave, but Dad had drifted off again and his breathing had settled into that shallow rhythm that meant he was deep asleep, so David and I finally left and drove back to the hotel. We were supposed to fly out that afternoon for our honeymoon in Hawaii, but I called the airline and canceled everything because I knew I couldn't be on a plane halfway across the Pacific if Dad took a turn for the worse. The next week passed in a blur of hospital visits and difficult conversations with family members who had heard about Jeremy's accusations. I showed the documents from Dad's envelope to anyone who asked, spreading the real bank statements and Dad's letter across kitchen tables and coffee shop tables while explaining what Jeremy had actually done. Most people were horrified and apologetic, saying they should have known better than to believe Jeremy, that they should have trusted me. But some people, including my mother, seemed almost disappointed that there wasn't a more interesting scandal, that the story was just my brother being a criminal and a liar instead of some complicated family drama with shades of gray. Aunt Rebecca took the news particularly hard because she had always been close to Jeremy and had defended him for years, making excuses for his absences and his selfish behavior. She called me crying and apologizing for not speaking up more forcefully at the rehearsal dinner, for letting Jeremy make those accusations without immediately shutting him down. I told her it wasn't her fault, that Jeremy had fooled all of us with his fake evidence, but she said she should have known better because she had always sensed something wasn't right about Jeremy's relationship with money. Dad died 8 days after my wedding, slipping away peacefully in his sleep with me sitting beside his bed reading aloud from the novel he had been working through before he got too sick to hold books. Angela called David to come pick me up because I couldn't stop crying long enough to drive myself home, and David arrived within 20 minutes and held me in the parking lot while I fell apart completely. The funeral was scheduled for the following Thursday, and I spent the days leading up to it making arrangements and fielding phone calls from relatives while trying to process the fact that Dad was actually gone. Jeremy didn't call or text, didn't offer to help with any of the planning, just disappeared completely after that night in the hospice room. I assumed he would skip the funeral entirely, but the morning of the service he called me and asked if he was even allowed to come. His voice sounded hollow and defeated, nothing like the confident, angry person who had stood up at my rehearsal dinner. I told him the funeral was at 2 that afternoon and he could make his own decision about attending, then hung up before he could say anything else. Part of me wanted him to stay away because I couldn't imagine standing near him while people paid respects to Dad, but another part wanted him there so everyone could see what he had done, so his presence would remind people of his betrayal. Jeremy showed up 10 minutes before the service started, looking terrible in a wrinkled suit that hung loosely on his frame, suggesting he had lost weight in the past 2 weeks. He sat in the back row and didn't approach me or any other family members, just stared at his hands while the minister talked about Dad's life and accomplishments. I gave a eulogy that I had written the night before, talking about how Dad had taught me to be honest and kind, and to always stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. I didn't mention Jeremy directly, but everyone in the room understood who I was talking about when I said Dad's greatest disappointment in life was watching someone he loved choose greed over integrity. After the service, during the reception at my aunt's house, several people approached Jeremy, and I could see them talking in low, intense voices, clearly confronting him about what he had done. Jeremy took it all without defending himself, just nodded and accepted whatever people said to him, looking more and more broken as the afternoon went on. I watched this from across the room and felt nothing but cold satisfaction that he was finally facing consequences for his actions. The will reading was scheduled for 1 week after the funeral, taking place in Bernard's office in downtown Dallas on a gray Monday morning that matched my mood perfectly. Bernard was a tall man in his 70s with white hair and sharp eyes, who had been Dad's attorney for over 30 years. He greeted me with a warm handshake and offered his condolences, then asked if Jeremy had been notified about the meeting. I told him I had sent Jeremy a text with the date and time but had no idea if he planned to attend. Bernard nodded and said we would give Jeremy 15 minutes past the scheduled start time before proceeding without him. David came with me for moral support, sitting quietly beside me in the leather chair while Bernard organized papers on his desk. Aunt Rebecca arrived a few minutes later, having been named as a secondary beneficiary in Dad's will, and she hugged me tightly before taking a seat across from Bernard's desk. We sat in uncomfortable silence watching the clock tick toward 11, and I was starting to think Jeremy wasn't coming when the door opened and he walked in looking even worse than he had at the funeral. Jeremy sat down in the chair farthest from everyone else and wouldn't make eye contact with any of us, just stared at the floor with his hands clasped between his knees. Bernard cleared his throat and began reading from Dad's will, starting with the standard legal language before moving into the specific bequests. Dad left the house to me along with his car and most of his personal possessions, which wasn't surprising since Jeremy had his own place and had made it clear over the years that he had no interest in keeping Dad's things. Then Bernard got to the financial assets, and this is where things got interesting. Dad had divided his estate into specific categories, first addressing his savings accounts and investments. Bernard explained that Dad had originally planned to split everything equally between Jeremy and me, with each of us receiving approximately $400,000 after taxes and final expenses. Aunt Rebecca would receive $50,000, and the rest would go to a cancer research charity that Dad had supported for years. But then Bernard paused and looked directly at Jeremy, saying that Dad had made significant changes to the will 3 weeks before his death, after discovering certain financial irregularities. Bernard pulled out a new document and explained that Dad had added a detailed section addressing the theft from his accounts, naming Jeremy specifically and documenting the $83,000 that had been transferred without authorization. The will stated clearly that Jeremy had stolen from Dad, that this theft was witnessed and documented by the bank, and that Dad's intention was to both expose the crime and ensure appropriate consequences. Bernard read Dad's words verbatim, his voice steady and professional, even as he described Jeremy's betrayal and the subsequent attempt to frame me for the theft. The room was completely silent except for Bernard's voice and the sound of Jeremy's increasingly labored breathing. Then Bernard got to the part where Dad outlined the modified distribution of his estate, and I watched Jeremy's face go from pale to gray to almost green. Dad had removed Jeremy entirely from the will, redistributing his share between me, Aunt Rebecca, and the cancer charity. But more than that, Dad had included a provision requiring Jeremy to repay the $83,000 he had stolen, with that amount being deducted from any potential inheritance he might receive from other family members in the future, essentially creating a lien against Jeremy's name. Jeremy made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob, and I saw his hands start to shake uncontrollably. Bernard continued reading, explaining that Dad had also documented Jeremy's attempt to frame me with falsified bank statements, describing in detail how Jeremy had altered records and presented them publicly at my rehearsal dinner with the intention of destroying my reputation. Dad's words were clinical and precise, laying out the timeline of Jeremy's actions and making it clear that this wasn't just theft, but a calculated campaign to avoid responsibility by blaming an innocent person. Bernard read Dad's final statement about Jeremy, a paragraph that said despite everything, Dad had hoped until his last days that Jeremy would confess and try to make amends, but that hope had been disappointed, and therefore Jeremy was being removed from the will and from Dad's life. The words hung in the air like a physical weight, and I could see Jeremy struggling to breathe properly, his chest heaving and his face turning an alarming shade of red. Then Bernard reached the final provision, the part that Dad had added just days before he died. Dad had left a sealed letter to be read aloud at the will reading, addressed to everyone present but specifically directed at Jeremy. Bernard opened the envelope carefully and pulled out 2 handwritten pages in Dad's shaky script. He began reading, and Dad's voice seemed to come through the words, telling Jeremy that he loved him despite everything, that a father's love didn't disappear even when his son made terrible choices, but that love didn't mean excusing or enabling destructive behavior. Dad wrote that Jeremy had been given every advantage in life, every opportunity to succeed, and had chosen instead to take shortcuts and blame others when those shortcuts led to disaster. He described watching Jeremy grow from a curious, kind child into someone he barely recognized, someone willing to hurt his own sister to avoid facing consequences. The letter went on to explain that Dad's greatest regret was not confronting Jeremy's character problems earlier, not setting firmer boundaries when Jeremy was younger and still capable of learning different patterns. But Dad also wrote that it was never too late for Jeremy to change, to take responsibility and rebuild his life on a foundation of honesty rather than deception. The final paragraph said Dad forgave Jeremy for the theft and the betrayal, but forgiveness didn't mean Jeremy could avoid the consequences of his actions, and those consequences included being cut from the will and exposed for what he had done. Jeremy stood up suddenly, his chair falling backward and hitting the floor with a loud crash. His face had gone from gray to completely white, and sweat was pouring down his temples despite the cool air conditioning in the office. He swayed on his feet and put one hand out toward the desk like he was trying to steady himself. Then his eyes rolled back and he collapsed onto the floor in a heap. David jumped up and knelt beside him while Bernard called for an ambulance, and I sat frozen in my chair watching my brother lying unconscious on the carpet. Part of me wanted to help him, wanted to check if he was breathing and make sure he was okay, but a bigger part of me couldn't move, couldn't feel anything except this strange sense of justice being served. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes and determined that Jeremy had fainted from shock and stress, that his blood pressure had dropped suddenly and his body had essentially shut down to protect itself. They loaded him onto a stretcher and asked if anyone wanted to ride with him to the hospital. I looked at David, who looked at Aunt Rebecca, who looked at me, and we all stayed exactly where we were while the paramedics took Jeremy away. Bernard suggested we take a break before continuing with the rest of the will, giving everyone time to process what had just happened. I walked out into the hallway with David and just stood there trying to understand what I was feeling. Relief that Dad had believed me and documented everything. Satisfaction that Jeremy had finally faced the truth of what he had done. But also this deep sadness that it had come to this, that my brother had destroyed himself and our relationship over money and pride. David held my hand and asked if I wanted to go check on Jeremy at the hospital, and I told him no, that Jeremy had made his choices and now he had to live with them, just as I had to live with the damage he had caused to my reputation and my wedding day. We went back into Bernard's office 20 minutes later, and he finished reading through the rest of the will, which was straightforward and contained no more surprises. Aunt Rebecca inherited $50,000 as originally planned, and she immediately said she wanted to give half of it to the cancer charity in Dad's memory. I would receive the house, the car, and approximately $580,000 after all the adjustments from Jeremy's removed share, money I had never expected and didn't particularly want given the circumstances that had created it. The meeting ended around noon and I drove home with David, both of us silent as we processed everything that had happened in that office. My phone started buzzing with texts and calls within an hour, family members who had somehow already heard about Jeremy fainting at the will reading, asking if he was okay and what had happened. I ignored most of them and spent the afternoon sitting on my couch staring at nothing while David made phone calls to reschedule our honeymoon. That evening, Aunt Rebecca came over with food she had cooked, saying she was worried about me and wanted to make sure I ate something. We sat at my kitchen table and she told me she had visited Jeremy at the hospital earlier, that he had been released after a few hours of observation and had gone home to his apartment. She said he looked destroyed, completely broken, and had asked her to tell me he was sorry for everything. I listened to this without responding, unsure what I was supposed to do with Jeremy's second-hand apology. Aunt Rebecca reached across the table and took my hand, telling me that forgiveness was a personal choice and I shouldn't feel pressured to reconcile with Jeremy just because he was family, or because Dad had forgiven him in that letter. She said Dad's forgiveness was about his own peace, his own ability to let go of anger before he died, but my forgiveness was different and I needed to take whatever time I needed to process my own feelings. Jeremy sent me a text message 3 days later asking if we could meet and talk, saying he understood if I said no, but he wanted a chance to apologize in person. I stared at that message for 2 hours before finally responding that I would meet him at a neutral location, a coffee shop halfway between our apartments, and he could say whatever he needed to say, but I wasn't making any promises about forgiveness or reconciliation. We met on a Saturday morning and Jeremy looked terrible, like he hadn't slept or eaten properly since the will reading. He ordered a coffee he didn't drink and I got tea I barely touched, and we sat across from each other in uncomfortable silence for several minutes before Jeremy started talking. He apologized for everything, the theft, the false accusations, the deliberate sabotage of my rehearsal dinner, all of it. He explained that his business had failed 2 years ago, and he had been hiding the debt from everyone, taking out loans and maxing out credit cards trying to keep everything afloat. When Dad got sick, Jeremy had seen the bank accounts as a solution to his problems, never thinking about the fact that he was stealing from his dying father. He said once he started taking the money, he couldn't stop, and when he realized someone might notice the missing funds, he panicked and created the fake evidence to frame me. I listened to Jeremy's confession without interrupting, watching him cry and apologize and try to explain his thinking, and I felt completely disconnected from the entire situation, hearing his words but not feeling them. When he finished talking, I told him I appreciated the apology but I didn't forgive him, that what he had done was unforgivable and had permanently destroyed any relationship we might have had. I explained that he hadn't just stolen money or made a mistake in judgment. He had actively tried to ruin my life, had stood in front of my friends and David's family and accused me of something horrible, knowing it was a lie. Jeremy nodded and said he understood, that he didn't expect forgiveness and didn't deserve it. He asked if there was anything he could do to make it right, any way he could repair even a fraction of the damage he had caused. I told him the only thing he could do was leave me alone and stay out of my life completely, that I didn't want apologies or explanations or attempts at reconciliation. I wanted him gone. Jeremy's face crumpled and he started crying harder, but he agreed, saying he would respect my wishes and wouldn't contact me again unless I reached out first. We left the coffee shop separately, and I drove home feeling empty and exhausted, drained by the effort of maintaining composure through that conversation. David and I finally took our postponed honeymoon 3 months later, spending 2 weeks in Hawaii trying to relax and move past everything that had happened. The trip helped, giving us space to be together without the constant weight of family drama and legal complications. We talked about Jeremy one night while sitting on our hotel balcony watching the sunset, and David asked if I thought I would ever forgive him. I told David honestly that I didn't know, that the betrayal was too deep and too calculated for me to just let it go, but maybe someday enough time would pass that I could at least think about Jeremy without feeling sick. David said whatever I decided was okay with him, that he would support me whether I chose to eventually reconcile or to cut Jeremy out of my life permanently. I appreciated that support more than I could express, knowing that David had chosen to believe me and stand by me even when Jeremy's accusations had planted doubt. We came home from Hawaii feeling renewed and ready to actually start our married life without the shadow of scandal hanging over us. 6 months after Dad's death, I used some of the inheritance money to start a foundation in his name, providing financial assistance to families dealing with terminal illness and the associated medical costs. It felt right to turn the money that had caused so much pain into something that could actually help people, and the foundation became a way to honor Dad's memory while also processing my own grief. Jeremy sent flowers to the foundation's opening event with a card that said he was proud of what I was doing and sorry he couldn't be there to support it in person. I threw the card away without reading it all the way through, unwilling to let Jeremy insert himself back into my life through gestures and apologies. Aunt Rebecca stayed in touch regularly, visiting for dinner once a month and helping with foundation events, becoming the family connection I needed without the toxicity that came with Jeremy. She told me occasionally that Jeremy had asked about me, that he was working to pay back the money he had stolen and trying to rebuild his life. But I never asked for details, and she respected my boundaries by not volunteering information I didn't request. A year after the will reading, I received notice that Jeremy had made the first payment toward repaying the $83,000, sending a check to Bernard's office with instructions to distribute it according to Dad's wishes. Bernard called to inform me that my portion of the repayment would be approximately $50,000 once everything was divided up, and asked what I wanted to do with it. I told him to donate my share directly to the foundation, that I didn't want money that came from Jeremy even if it was technically owed to me. Bernard said he would handle it and mentioned that Jeremy had included a note with the payment, saying he knew this didn't fix anything, but he was committed to making restitution even if it took him years. I told Bernard I didn't need to see the note and hung up, refusing to engage with Jeremy's attempts at redemption. David asked me later if I thought I was being too harsh, too unwilling to even acknowledge that Jeremy was trying to make amends, and I explained that Jeremy's repayment wasn't about me. It was about Jeremy trying to feel better about himself, trying to convince himself that he was a good person who had just made mistakes. I didn't owe Jeremy forgiveness or recognition just because he was finally doing the bare minimum of what he should have done from the beginning. 2 years after Dad died, I found out through Aunt Rebecca that Jeremy had gotten engaged to someone he had been dating for about 6 months, a woman named Michelle who apparently knew about everything that had happened with our family. Aunt Rebecca asked carefully if I wanted to know any details, and I told her no, that Jeremy's life was no longer any of my business, and I preferred to keep it that way. She nodded and didn't bring him up again for several months, respecting the boundary I had set. David and I were doing well, settling into our life together and building our own family traditions separate from the drama that had marked our wedding. We bought a house using part of my inheritance, a small place with a yard where we could eventually raise kids when we were ready. Life moved forward the way it's supposed to, with work and friends and normal concerns that had nothing to do with betrayal or stolen money or family scandals. Sometimes I would think about Jeremy and wonder if he had actually changed or if he was just better at hiding his true nature now, but those thoughts became less frequent as time passed and the wounds slowly healed. 3 years after the rehearsal dinner disaster, I was cleaning out Dad's house, finally ready to sell it and close that chapter of my life, when I found a journal Dad had kept during his final months. I sat on his bedroom floor and read through entries that documented his thoughts about dying, his regrets and hopes, and his complicated feelings about both his children. In one entry dated 2 weeks before he died, Dad wrote about Jeremy's theft and the decision to cut him from the will, explaining that he had agonized over it but ultimately felt it was the only way to force Jeremy to face real consequences for once in his life. Dad wrote that he had enabled Jeremy for too long, always making excuses and bailing him out of problems, and that pattern had created the person Jeremy became. But Dad also wrote that he hoped Jeremy would eventually learn from this experience and become someone better, someone honest and accountable. The journal entry ended with Dad writing about me, saying he was proud of how I had handled everything, that my strength and integrity were exactly what he had hoped to instill in his children, and that he died knowing at least one of them had turned out right. I closed the journal and cried there on the floor of Dad's empty bedroom, grieving for him all over again, and for the relationship with Jeremy that could have been, but never was. That evening, I took Dad's journal home and put it on my bookshelf, a reminder of who Dad had been and what he had tried to teach us, lessons Jeremy had rejected and I had carried forward into my own life. The foundation thrived and became my primary focus outside of my marriage and career, helping dozens of families over the years and creating a legacy that Dad would have been proud of. Jeremy faded into the background of my life, existing somewhere but not in my daily reality, a person I had once known but no longer recognized or wanted to know. Some people told me I should try to reconcile, that life was short and family was important, but those people hadn't experienced what I had experienced, hadn't felt the specific betrayal of having someone you trusted try to destroy you to save themselves. I made peace with my decision to cut Jeremy out completely, understanding that forgiveness wasn't always necessary or even healthy, that sometimes the right choice was to walk away and build a life free from toxicity. David supported this completely, never pushing me to reach out to Jeremy or suggesting that I was being too unforgiving, just accepting my boundaries and helping me maintain them. Our marriage was stronger for it, built on a foundation of trust and honesty that had been tested early and proven solid. 5 years after Dad's death, on what would have been his 75th birthday, I visited his grave alone and told him about everything that had happened in the years since he died, about the foundation and my life with David, and the peace I had found in letting Jeremy go. Standing there in the quiet cemetery with flowers in my hand, I finally felt like I had honored Dad's memory in the way that mattered most, not by forgiving Jeremy or maintaining family unity at any cost, but by living with integrity and refusing to accept betrayal as something that could be explained away or forgiven, simply because the person who committed it shared my DNA and said he was sorry. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.